My past 3 videos have been summaries for each respective story in Tales from the Pizzaplex Book 7, Tiger Rock, those stories being Tiger Rock, The Monty Within, and Bleeding Heart. If you haven't already, I'd recommend that you go watch those summaries, but in today's video, we're going to be doing a summary for the epilogue of the book, the 7th epilogue in Tales from the Pizzaplex series. Epilogues 1 and 3 were really cool, but as they went along, they started to just feel repetitive and a bit boring. So I hope that the 7th epilogue doesn't continue that trend and ends up actually being good. So, without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy, and let's get started. The epilogue begins right where we left off and shows the reactions of Kelly and Lucia to Jace's death. Kelly was stomping through the pizzeria crying and not saying anything. She wouldn't stop walking through the room until she tripped and fell on the ground. Lucia walked over next to her and asked if she was okay. Lucia was even questioning why she herself wasn't crying. Even though she had immense feelings for Adrian and very little for Jace, the kiss Jace laid on her right before he went off on his suicide mission changed everything, but none of that mattered anymore because now he was dead. But Lucia knew there was no time for that. Now that the Mimic was confined, what Jace had given his life for, they would have time to look around for a way out. Suddenly a crack sounded through the building, and there was silence for a minute until clanks sounded from the far end of the hall. Kelly knew it was the Mimic and took off running again, now once again in panic mode, running away as if the Mimic was right behind her despite it actually just being in a storage room on the opposite side of the building. Or at least she thought it was, but then it dawned on her, what if the Mimic actually did escape? Then Jace would have died for nothing. She got that thought out of her head though, instead choosing to believe that the sounds were confined and that he could hit the door all he wanted, but he couldn't escape. So she turned her attention back to Kelly, who made it to the main door of the pizzeria and began hopelessly slashing at the concrete to no avail. Lucia followed behind Kelly, trying to stop her. Kelly screamed for Lucia to help her move the rebel out of the way of the door, but Lucia just tried to calm Kelly down, telling her that it was no use. Another thud came from the other side of the pizzeria, and Lucia continued to try and calm Kelly down, which ended up leading to an altercation where they slapped each other a couple times before Lucia got Kelly under control. She told her that they couldn't get out through here because even if they managed to get all this rebel out of the way, there was still a mountain of poured concrete on the other side blocking them in. She was about to tell her that they'd find a different way out when they heard another sound. But the problem with this sound in particular was where it came from, and it wasn't the storage room. The Mimic was out. Very interestingly, we next get the perspective of the Mimic itself. The Mimic at the moment was programmed to break off all limbs and heads of objects that had limbs and heads, which it had just done to a supposed unit that was in the little tunnel, which was of course Jace. It really shows that the Mimic really has no ill intentions. It was basically just making the same mistake that Phone Guy had assumed the animatronics made back in FNaF 1. Obviously in FNaF 1 the animatronics didn't think people were endoskeletons, but the Mimic actually does. As it was inside the room they'd blocked it into, it found a pigtailed plushie, and since it matched the established design of an endoskeleton, which to him was simply having arms and legs and a head, it tore off all those parts and threw them all in a pile in the corner of the room. It then turned to the door and tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. So he broke it off and opened the door. Behind the door was a bunch of tables and stuff blocking him, which his programming didn't tell him how to get past. So it recalled how Jace tried to crawl through the vent and decided it would copy what he did. So it crawled into the vent, expanding and contracting to be able to fit and digging its claws through the metal to ensure that it wouldn't slide back down, and it continued through the vent. It seems Jace was wrong. The Mimic was able to go through the vent without breaking it and falling through. Cutting back to Lucia and Kelly, Lucia convinced Kelly that they don't have time before the Mimic comes to kill them. So she led Kelly through the dining room, grabbing 2 endoskeleton arms along the way, and then led her to the back room where they'd found the Mimic when he pretended on the radio to be stuck in the pizzeria too. She told Kelly that the plan was to hide in these costumes in this back area because the Mimic was clearly following a messed up program to kill humans, and that he obviously doesn't destroy these costumes, meaning that they should be able to hide inside them to blend in. Based on the sounds Lucia could hear, it was clear that the Mimic was out of the vents now. Kelly was skeptical of the plan, but she begrudgingly went through with it. Lucia almost accidentally got into a springlock suit, which she had learned about, including that they could be lethal from the manual that taught them about the Mimic. They both ended up getting costumes that worked. Lucia was pretty sure that this plan would work as long as they were still when they were near the Mimic. The pizzeria seemed to be silent, and Lucia decided to explain to Kelly her plan. Apparently, when they were all searching for a way out, which dawned on Lucia the fact that she and Kelly were the only ones of 8 that were still alive, that she noticed that the concrete blocking the exit door at the backstage area had crumbled more than it had at other areas, so she wanted to try and use the endoskeleton arm she'd grabbed to lever the chunks of concrete away from the door. So they headed over there and began working, talking about concrete as they did. Lucia honestly felt that doing this was pointless, but she knew that it would be better than just sitting around doing nothing, which would cause a meltdown. Suddenly, Lucia noticed the dining room lights flickering and told Kelly to put on her costume's mask, and they both did. They stood still as they knew the mimic was close by. They tried their best to be quiet, only releasing the sounds of their breathing, and as the mimic got closer they started breathing louder, and Lucia worried that the mimic would hear them, but they both stayed as still as possible while Lucia's thoughts ended up wandering. But then, after a while of doing math equations in her head, she realized that she had stopped hearing the mimic and the lights were back on. She was about to remove her mask when she noticed something. She'd unconsciously memorized all the colors of the costumes in the backstage area, and she realized one didn't belong. It was a brighter reddish pink, which was part of a mushroom cap. They remained still, and Lucia hoped Kelly would recognize that she had a reason for this. Suddenly, the Mario mimic's head moved, causing Kelly to quietly gasp, but it was enough that the mimic turned and began to walk towards them just as the stage lights went out. They came back on a second later as Lucia watched the mimic crawl out of the costume, but she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Because the mimic had usually been vaguely man-shaped, it took everything for Lucia not to scream as she saw the mimic crawl out of the mushroom looking like it had 9 legs, with one eye on its leg and another on its back, with a leg extended where its mouth should have been. It was a contorted mess of twisted metal, and as it moved, it made a different sound, one that was much more disturbing than the one its footsteps usually made. Apparently, it was too much for Kelly to take, and she began running. Hesitantly, Lucia yelled for her to stop, and she surprisingly did. The mimic began walking towards Kelly, who was inside a blue dog costume, and it seemed to be studying it and processing the fact that it wasn't there when it came in the first time. The mimic then began to walk away, but then, right after Lucia started to think that it was all over and that it would all be okay, the mimic, in an instant, shot out one of its legs and peeled back a piece of the blue dog costume and shot itself into the costume with Kelly, releasing a crunch sound and Kelly's scream. But the scream wasn't the worst part. After the crunch, there were a few snapping sounds, and Kelly's screams got louder. There was then a bunch of spongy, wet splintering sounds as the costume extremely quickly filled with blood. There was another crunch, and Kelly stopped screaming. Lucia could do nothing but bear witness as Kelly died, and the costume folded in on itself and into an upright animatronic before it walked away, leaving a pool of Kelly's blood where she was standing in the costume seconds before. But that is the end of the 7th Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogue. I think this epilogue was definitely better than the last 2 or 3, but it still did feel just a little repetitive, but less so than the last 2. Many people have been discussing that the mimic killed Kelly by going into the same costume that Kelly was inside, which people are believing will stick to the mimic, being the corpse that we can find on Burntrap, which is very interesting, but because it ended there, we don't really know for sure if Kelly's corpse will remain on the mimic or not, but it's very possible. We'll have to wait and see, but that marks the end of my final summary for Tales from the Pizzaplex Book 7. I plan on releasing a video soon ranking all the stories from both Nexi and Tiger Rock, though I'm not sure whether that will be really soon or in a few weeks, but stay tuned for whenever that does end up coming out. But anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!